The bustling airport in New York City was alive with energy, a cacophony of voices, footsteps, and the distant roar of jet engines. Travelers hurried along the concourse, each person immersed in their own world, their faces painted with a mosaic of emotions: anticipation, anxiety, joy, and fatigue. Amidst this whirlwind of humanity, an elderly man named Harold sat quietly in a corner, clutching a bouquet of vibrant red roses on his lap. The flowers stood in stark contrast to his weathered hands, their petals soft and full of life, while his skin was marked with the lines of age and experience. Harold's eyes, a pale blue dulled by time, were fixed on the arrivals board, but he seemed lost in thought, as if the words and numbers displayed were merely a backdrop to the memories that danced in his mind. The roses, their fragrance sweet and intoxicating, were a symbol of something deeply significant. Yet the man's expression was a mixture of hope and sorrow, creating an aura of mystery that surrounded him. As the minutes turned into hours, his presence began to attract the attention of airport staff. Among them was Brian, a keen-eyed security officer with a sharp sense of observation. He was patrolling the area when he first noticed Harold. The contrast of the elderly man's stillness against the flurry of activity around him struck Brian as odd. It was unusual for someone to remain in one spot for so long, especially in a place as frenetic as an airport. Brian's instincts kicked in, and he felt a twinge of concern gnawing at him. "Hey there, sir." Brian approached with a friendly demeanor, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the terminal. "Is everything all right? You've been sitting here for a while." Harold looked up, momentarily disoriented, as if he had just awoken from a dream. His gaze rested on Brian, and then slowly he nodded. Yes, I'm fine. Just waiting for someone." The vague response only deepened Brian's intrigue. "Waiting for someone? Is it family?" he asked, trying to gauge the situation further. Harold hesitated, his fingers tightening around the stems of the roses. "In a way, yes. Someone very special to me," he replied, his voice laced with an emotion that Brian couldn't quite place. Was it nostalgia, or perhaps regret? Brian sensed there was more to Harold's story than he was letting on. Sometimes it helps to talk about it. "I'm here if you want to share," he offered, hoping to coax the man into opening up. With a slight sigh, Harold leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting back to the arrivals board. It's been a long time," he murmured, his eyes glazing over with unshed tears. "We haven't seen each other in years." "Years?" Brian echoed, his curiosity piqued further. "Is it a daughter? A wife?" "An old friend," Harold replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "My wife, she passed away a few years ago. I always loved bringing her roses when we would meet. Today is supposed to be special." Brian's heart ached for the elderly man. He could see the weight of memory pressing down on Harold's shoulders. "I'm really sorry to hear that," he said gently. "It sounds like you're holding on to something beautiful." Harold's expression shifted as he took a deep breath, the bouquet resting heavily in his lap. "Yes, it was beautiful, but life has a way of taking those things away from you, doesn't it?" His voice trembled slightly, revealing a vulnerability that resonated with Brian. "I can only imagine," Brian replied, his empathy growing. "But maybe this meeting is a chance to reconnect with that love, to celebrate what you had." "Reconnect," Harold echoed, his voice trailing off as he gazed into the distance. "I wish it were that simple." Brian leaned closer, sensing the deep-seated emotions swirling within Harold. "What do you mean?" The old man finally turned to Brian, his eyes filled with a mixture of longing and sorrow. "It's complicated. We lost touch after her death. My daughter, she didn't understand. I've been waiting for her to come back, to mend things, to forgive me." "Forgive you?" Brian questioned, intrigued. "What happened?" Harold paused, his gaze shifting once more to the bouquet in his hands, as if it held the answers to his pain. So many things left unsaid, misunderstandings, anger. "I just wanted to show her that love doesn't die, even when the person does." His voice cracked, revealing the raw emotion beneath his stoic exterior. Brian felt a lump form in his throat. "You're a brave man, Harold. I can see how much you care." "Care?" Harold scoffed lightly, though a hint of a smile broke through. "It's too late for that now. I'm not sure she would even recognize me anymore. I've changed. Life has changed. Maybe she's waiting for you too, Brian suggested, his tone earnest. Sometimes, people just need a little nudge to remember what really matters. Harold looked at Brian, his expression softening as he considered the possibility. You really think so? I do, Brian replied, his voice steady and reassuring. Sometimes, all it takes is a gesture, a symbol. Like those roses. They can represent more than just love. They can symbolize hope too. Harold smiled faintly, the idea taking root in his heart. Hope. Yes, I suppose that's what I'm clinging to. Just then, a group of travelers rushed past, their laughter ringing out like music, momentarily distracting Harold from his thoughts. Brian watched as the elderly man's face lit up with a glimmer of nostalgia, as if he were momentarily transported to a time when joy was a part of his everyday life. Do you remember the last time you saw her? Brian asked, trying to gently steer the conversation back. Vaguely, Harold replied, his brows furrowing in concentration. It was a long time ago. I was supposed to meet her for dinner, but things happened. I didn't make it. He sighed deeply, the weight of regret heavy in the air between them. What happened? Brian inquired, his curiosity intertwining with empathy. Life, Harold murmured. Work got in the way. I thought I had more time, but time slipped away like sand through my fingers. And now here I am, waiting, hoping. Brian nodded, feeling the gravity of Harold's words. It's never too late to reach out. You're here now, and that counts for something. Maybe, Harold replied, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. But what if she's moved on? What if she doesn't want to see me? Then you'll know, Brian said firmly. But what if she does? What if this moment is the beginning of something new? Harold's gaze softened at Brian's words, the hope rekindling within him. You're right. I guess I've been afraid of facing the truth. Facing it is the first step, Brian encouraged, his tone sincere. You've already taken the first step by being here, by holding on to those roses. The elderly man looked down at the bouquet, a mixture of determination and trepidation crossing his features. Maybe I should call her, he murmured almost to himself. Do you have her number? Brian asked, his heart racing at the thought of Harold taking that leap. I do, Harold replied, his voice gaining strength. But, no buts, Brian interjected gently. You've come this far. Make the call. With a deep breath, Harold nodded resolutely. You're right. I'll do it. He rummaged through his pockets, retrieving an old flip phone that looked like it had seen better days. Now, where's that number? As Harold fumbled with the phone, Brian stood close by, feeling an overwhelming sense of pride for the elderly man. The atmosphere around them shifted, the weight of the moment palpable, as if the world had paused to witness this act of courage. Here it is, Harold finally said, his fingers trembling slightly as he dialed the number. He raised the phone to his ear, anticipation etched on his features as he listened to the ringing on the other end. Brian held his breath, praying that this call would lead to something beautiful. A moment later, Harold's expression fell, his shoulders slumping slightly. Voicemail, he muttered, disappointment lacing his voice. I'll leave a message. As he began to speak, Brian could hear the tremor in Harold's voice, the vulnerability of a man laying bare his heart to a daughter he hadn't seen in years. Hello, Emily. It's your father. Brian couldn't help but feel the weight of emotion in the air, the unspoken words hanging like a heavy mist over the terminal. Harold's voice cracked, revealing the years of hurt and longing that had built up inside him. I'm here at the airport, waiting for you. I have roses. I just wanted you to know that I love you, and I'm sorry for everything. I hope you'll come. As Harold ended the call, a profound silence enveloped them. The bustling sounds of the airport faded into the background. Brian looked at Harold, seeing the mix of fear and hope etched on his face. I did it, Harold whispered, disbelief mingling with relief. I did it. Yes. Harold sat in the bustling airport, his frail hands gently cradling the bouquet of roses, their vibrant red petals contrasting with the dull gray of the terminal surroundings. Each flower was a reminder of the love he had shared with his late wife, Margaret, and as he gazed at them, memories flooded his mind. Her laughter, her gentle touch, the way she would tease him about his old-fashioned ways. The scent of the roses, sweet and nostalgic, filled his senses, transporting him back to moments that seemed both distant and vividly alive. Beautiful flowers, aren't they? Brian, the airport security officer, broke into Harold's reverie, his voice warm and inviting. Brian had spent hours observing the elderly man, intrigued by his unwavering gaze and the bouquet that seemed as much a part of him as the faded blue cardigan he wore. Harold looked up, startled from his thoughts, and nodded slowly. "They remind me of a love that never faded," he replied, his voice a gentle rasp. "These are for my wife. Today would have been our anniversary." Brian felt a pang of empathy. He had seen many heart-wrenching situations in his role as a security officer, but something about Harold struck a chord deep within him. He took a seat next to the old man, his curiosity piqued. "I'm sorry for your loss. How long has it been?" 5 years, Harold said, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It feels like a lifetime, and yet every day is still filled with her presence. I thought I'd celebrate our anniversary as if she were here with me. I came to wait for her, hoping she might somehow feel my love." Brian absorbed Harold's words, feeling the weight of his grief. "Do you come here often?" he asked, seeking to draw Harold out further. Harold chuckled softly, a sound tinged with sorrow. "Not really. I used to, when we traveled together. But now," he trailed off, the words hanging in the air between them. "I wanted to feel close to her today." A silence enveloped them, filled only by the distant sounds of rolling luggage and the occasional announcement over the PA system. Brian watched as Harold absently stroked the petals of the roses, his fingers trembling slightly. "Can I ask you something?" Brian ventured, his tone gentle. "What do you miss most about her?" Harold's gaze drifted to the chaos of the terminal, but his mind was elsewhere, back to a sunlit afternoon in their garden, where Margaret had danced among the flowers, her laughter like music. "Everything," he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "Her smile, her warmth, the way she made everything feel right in the world. She was my anchor." Brian could feel the depth of Harold's sorrow, as if it radiated from him in waves. Have you been able to share this with anyone?" he asked cautiously. "I have a daughter," Harold replied, the pain in his voice evident. "But we haven't spoken in years. I thought today might be a chance to reconnect, to show her that love never truly dies." Brian's heart ached for Harold. "That sounds like a beautiful intention. Maybe she'll surprise you." A flicker of hope crossed Harold's face, but it was quickly overshadowed by a shadow of doubt. "I don't know if she'd even want to see me. We had disagreements, misunderstandings. I thought time would heal them, but it only seems to have created a bigger chasm." The two men sat in silence, the weight of their conversation settling over them like a soft blanket. Brian felt compelled to lighten the mood, to bridge the gap between their experiences with a shared moment of levity. "You know, my grandma used to say that a good flower arrangement can fix just about anything." Harold chuckled, a genuine smile breaking through the sadness. "I wish I could say that about my arrangement here. It's a bit lopsided, isn't it?" He gestured with a shaky hand to the roses. "I think they're perfect," Brian replied, grinning. "Just like love, imperfect, but beautiful all the same." The conversation flowed more easily now, and as they spoke, Brian learned more about Harold's life. He listened intently as Harold recounted stories of his youth, how he had met Margaret at a dance in their small town, her radiant smile lighting up the room. She wore a blue dress that night, he recalled, his eyes sparkling with nostalgia. "I remember thinking I'd never seen anything so lovely." Brian leaned in, captivated by Harold's memories. "Did you dance with her?" "Oh, we did." Harold's face lit up, the shadows of grief momentarily lifted. "I stepped on her toes more times than I can count, but she laughed it off. Just means you're trying too hard," she'd say. As the hours ticked by, Brian felt a growing sense of responsibility for Harold's well-being. He noticed how the elderly man's energy seemed to wane, his eyes losing some of their spark. "Harold," he said gently, "how about we get you something to eat? You must be hungry after all this waiting." Harold shook his head, waving a dismissive hand. "I'm fine, really. I just want to stay here." Brian's brow furrowed with concern. I understand, but it's important to take care of yourself too. How about I grab us both a snack? It'll give us more time to talk. Reluctantly, Harold agreed, his voice barely above a whisper. All right, if you insist. As Brian stood to leave, he hesitated, looking back at Harold. You're not alone, you know. I'm here. Thank you, Brian, Harold replied, his voice thick with emotion. You've been a good friend in this lonely place. Brian smiled warmly, feeling a connection with the old man that transcended their age difference. He moved through the crowds, his mind racing with thoughts of Harold's story and how love could weave its way through the fabric of life, leaving threads of joy and sorrow intertwined. When he returned with a small sandwich and a bottle of water, he found Harold gazing off into the distance, lost in thought once more. I hope you like peanut butter, Brian said, setting the food down gently. Harold blinked as if awakening from a dream. Oh, it's perfect. Thank you, really. I haven't eaten much today. He picked up the sandwich, a look of appreciation washing over his features. They shared the meal in companionable silence, the bustling airport around them fading into the background. As Harold took a bite, he spoke between chews. You know, Brian, I never imagined I'd be sitting here, sharing my life story with a stranger. Sometimes it just happens, Brian replied, smiling. Life has a funny way of bringing people together. Indeed, Harold said, his voice softening. And I'm grateful for it. It's easy to feel invisible at my age, like one of those forgotten flowers in a bouquet. Not to me, Brian assured him, his tone earnest. You've got a lot of life in you yet, Harold. Your stories matter, and your love is still alive. As the day melted into evening, the airport lights flickered on, casting a warm glow across the terminal. Harold's eyelids grew heavy, and Brian noticed the old man struggling to maintain his composure. You've been so strong, Brian said, concern etched across his face. But I think it's time we call for some help, just to check in on you. No, I'm all right, Harold insisted, though his voice betrayed his weariness. Harold, Brian pressed gently, I can't just stand by and let you fade away. You deserve to be taken care of. After a moment's hesitation, Harold nodded, his shoulders slumping as he surrendered to the fatigue that had been creeping in. All right, maybe I could use a hand. Brian quickly called for backup, explaining the situation to his colleagues. As he waited for assistance, he felt a deep sense of responsibility for Harold's well-being. In the brief moments of silence that followed, he watched the old man, who seemed to be on the brink of drifting off. Harold, Brian said softly, trying to keep the conversation going, what would you tell your daughter if you had the chance? Harold's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment he looked lost. I would tell her that I love her, that I've always loved her, even when we fought. That life is too short for regrets. Brian nodded, moved by the vulnerability in Harold's words. I think she'd want to hear that. I believe it's never too late to reach out. Just then, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the terminal, and Brian's colleagues arrived, ready to assist. As they approached, Harold's gaze grew distant once again, lost in thought. Brian felt a pang of urgency. He wanted Harold to feel the support surrounding him, to know that he was not alone. Hey, Harold, Brian said, leaning closer. You're in good hands now. Just relax, okay? The elderly man nodded, but the look in his eyes spoke of a deeper turmoil. I hope my daughter knows how much I've missed her. Brian placed a reassuring hand on Harold's shoulder. We'll do everything we can to make that happen. You deserve that reunion. As the airport staff began to check on Harold, Brian remained close, his heart heavy with. Harold sat in the bustling airport terminal, the vibrant atmosphere swirling around him while he remained still, lost in a delicate web of memories. The bouquet of roses on his lap seemed to carry the weight of his past, each petal a reminder of love once shared and the pain of absence that now accompanied him. He gently stroked the petals, their velvety softness contrasting sharply with the hard plastic of the airport seat. With each passing moment, he felt the distance between him and his estranged daughter, a gulf widened by years of silence and misunderstandings. Brian, the observant security officer, continued to keep an eye on Harold from a distance. He had seen many unusual situations during his time at the airport, but something about this elderly man tugged at his heartstrings. Perhaps it was the way Harold's gaze seemed to linger on the arrivals board, or how he clutched those roses as if they were a lifeline. Brian felt an urge to delve deeper into Harold's story, sensing that the man had more to share than he had initially revealed. As Brian approached Harold, the noise of the airport faded into a soft murmur in his ears. He could see the weariness etched on Harold's face, the lines of age telling tales of joy and sorrow. "Excuse me, sir," he said gently, his voice warm and inviting. "I just wanted to check in on you. You've been here a while." Harold looked up, momentarily startled from his reverie. He offered a weak smile, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Yes, I suppose I have. Just waiting for someone," he replied, his voice trembling slightly. Brian took a seat beside him, intrigued. "Waiting for a long time, I take it? Do you want to talk about it?" The elderly man hesitated, glancing at the bouquet of roses before sighing deeply. "It's complicated," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm waiting for my daughter. We haven't spoken in years." Brian's curiosity piqued. "What happened, if you don't mind me asking?" Harold's gaze drifted back to the arrivals board, where travelers reunited with loved ones, their laughter and joy contrasting with his own solitude. "It's a long story," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "A misunderstanding, really. I thought I was doing what was best for her, and she thought I didn't care." Brian nodded, sensing the weight of Harold's words. "Sometimes misunderstandings can create bigger rifts than we realize." "How long has it been since you last spoke?" 3 years, Harold replied, his voice cracking. 3 long years filled with silence. "I tried to reach out, but she never responded. I thought I'd surprise her today. I thought she might come to the airport, but..." His voice trailed off, and he looked down at the roses, the vibrant red now a painful reminder of his estrangement. Brian placed a reassuring hand on Harold's shoulder. "I'm sure she'll show up. You have to hold on to hope." Harold smiled faintly. "Hope? I used to have so much of it. But life has a way of dimming even the brightest flames." As they spoke, Brian learned more about Harold's life. The old man shared stories of his late wife, the love they had shared, and how they had raised their daughter together. He spoke of family gatherings filled with laughter, of holidays spent together, and the heart-wrenching day he lost his wife to illness. "After her passing, things changed," Harold said quietly. "I tried to keep our family together, but it felt like I was holding on to sand. The tighter I grasped, the more it slipped away." Brian listened intently, feeling a deep empathy for the man beside him. "It sounds like you did your best. Sometimes we can't control how others perceive our actions." Harold nodded, the sorrow in his eyes palpable. "I just wanted what was best for her. I thought my decisions would protect her, but instead, they pushed her away. I miss her so much." Just then, the airport lights dimmed slightly, signaling the transition from day to night. Brian noticed Harold's posture sagging, the weariness of the past few days pressing down on him. "Are you feeling all right, sir?" he asked, concern creeping into his voice. Harold shook his head, a bittersweet smile breaking through his melancholy. "I'll be fine. Just a little tired, I suppose. It's been a long wait, but I can't leave just yet. Not without seeing her." Brian's sense of responsibility kicked in. He felt an urge to protect this fragile soul. "Let me call for some assistance. We want to make sure you're taken care of while you wait." Harold's eyes widened slightly. "You don't have to do that, really. I can manage." "I insist," Brian said firmly. He stood up and waved over a colleague, a fellow officer who had just finished a round of checks. "Hey, can you call for medical assistance? I think this gentleman could use a nurse's attention." As his colleague moved to comply, Brian sat back down beside Harold. "You're not alone in this. You've got people who care, even if it doesn't feel that way right now." Harold looked at Brian, gratitude evident in his gaze. "Thank you. It's been a long time since someone cared enough to check in on me." Moments later, a nurse arrived, her friendly demeanor radiating warmth. "Hello, I'm here to take a look at you," she said, kneeling beside Harold and offering a gentle smile. "How are you feeling?" Harold took a deep breath, his heart swelling with a mix of emotions. "I'm all right, just a bit weary from waiting." The nurse examined him carefully, her hands deftly checking his pulse and blood pressure. "You've been sitting for a while. How about we get you some water and a snack? It might help." Harold nodded, grateful for the kindness. "That would be lovely, thank you." As the nurse stepped away to fetch the refreshments, Brian turned to Harold, eager to keep the conversation flowing. "Do you want to share more about your daughter? What's her name?" "Emily," Harold said, the name slipping from his lips like a prayer. "She was always so full of life, an artist with dreams as big as the sky. I used to take her to art shows, and we would spend hours discussing the meanings behind each piece." Brian smiled, picturing a young Emily, her eyes alight with passion and creativity. "Sounds like you had a wonderful bond." "We did," Harold agreed, his voice thick with nostalgia. "But I always worried about her. I wanted her to be safe, to follow a secure path. I didn't realize I was suffocating her spirit. I pushed her away when I should have held her closer." The nurse returned, carrying a bottle of water and a small plate of crackers. "Here you go," she said cheerfully, handing them to Harold. "Take your time and eat something. It'll help." "Thank you," Harold murmured, taking a sip of water and nibbling on a cracker. The simple act of nourishment felt like a small victory. Brian watched, relieved to see Harold care for himself, even if just a little. As the minutes ticked by, more airport staff began to gather near Harold, drawn by his poignant story and the bouquet of roses that seemed to radiate a quiet sorrow. They exchanged glances, their expressions reflecting a mix of empathy and curiosity. "Is he okay?" one staff member asked Brian, who nodded in response. "He's been waiting for his daughter. They've been estranged for years," Brian explained, his voice low enough for only a few to hear. Another employee chimed in, her voice soft. "That's so sad. Love can be so complicated." Harold overheard their whispers, and though he felt exposed, he also felt a strange sense of comfort. The support of these strangers reminded him that he wasn't entirely alone in his vigil. He glanced at the roses, their vibrant hue oddly comforting amidst the grayness of his situation. One of the staff members, a young woman with kind eyes, stepped forward. "If you'd like, we can help you look for her. Maybe we can announce her name over the intercom." Harold looked up, hope flickering in his chest. "You do that for me?" "Of course," she replied, determination in her voice. "Everyone deserves a chance to reunite with their loved ones." Brian nodded in agreement. "Let's do it. The more people who know, the better chance we have of finding her." The group rallied together, sharing ideas and encouraging one another. They brainstormed ways to reach out to Emily, hoping to bring the father and daughter back together. Harold felt the warmth of their support enveloping him, a soothing balm on his aching heart. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow through the airport windows, Harold found himself surrounded by a small crowd of compassionate strangers, all united by the simple act of kindness. They shared stories of their own families, laughter mingling with the bittersweet atmosphere of Harold's vigil. In that moment, Harold realized that love, in all its complexities, was a force that could bridge even the widest of gaps. The roses on his lap, once a symbol of despair, now blossomed with the possibility of forgiveness and reconciliation. He held on to hope tightly, waiting not just for his daughter, but for the promise of a new beginning, one that might still be possible even after so many years lost in silence. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting an array of orange and pink hues across the bustling terminal, Brian felt a tightening in his chest as he looked at Harold. The elderly man, with his white hair and weathered hands clutching the bouquet of roses, seemed to embody a profound blend of hope and resignation. 3 days had passed since he first sat there, and Brian couldn't shake off the feeling that time was slipping away from them both. "Do you think she's coming?" Brian asked gently, taking a seat beside Harold, his eyes scanning the busy crowd. The sounds of rolling suitcases and hurried conversations filled the air, but amidst it all, Harold seemed in his own world. Harold sighed, his gaze fixed on the bouquet. "She promised she would, Brian. I know she will," he replied, his voice steady but laced with a hint of uncertainty. "It's our anniversary, after all. We used to celebrate it together, every year without fail." He paused, lost in a memory that brought a soft smile to his lips. She loved roses. Always said they reminded her of the first time we met. Brian nodded, moved by the man's unwavering faith. It's beautiful that you're waiting for her. Love like that doesn't just fade away. Sometimes it feels like it does, Harold whispered, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. He turned to Brian, his expression shifting to one of vulnerability. You know, I haven't spoken to my daughter in years. She doesn't understand. I thought if I could show her just how much I loved her mother, maybe she would come around. Brian felt a pang of empathy as he listened, wishing he could ease Harold's pain. It sounds like you've had a lot of time to think about it. Have you tried reaching out to her? Harold shook his head, his face falling. I've tried, believe me, but every time I pick up the phone, something holds me back. I don't want to push her further away. I get that, Brian replied, considering his own family dynamics. But what if she's waiting for you to make the first move? Sometimes it takes just one person to bridge the gap. The old man smiled weakly, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Perhaps you're right. This is the longest I've ever waited for anything, and yet here I am. It's just, I don't want to lose her, too. As the hours crept by, Brian couldn't shake the worry that gnawed at him. He glanced at Harold, who was now visibly fatigued, his hands trembling slightly as they gripped the roses. Do you want me to get you something to eat or drink? Brian asked, concern etched on his face. Harold waved a dismissive hand, though his expression softened. No, I couldn't eat. Not while I'm waiting. Brian sighed. Harold, you need to take care of yourself. Just like you're waiting for your daughter, she might be waiting for you to be healthy and strong. At that moment, a nurse from the airport clinic approached them, her name tag reading Lisa. She had been observing from a distance, intrigued by the scene unfolding before her. Excuse me, sir, she said to Harold, her voice warm and kind. I couldn't help but notice you've been here for quite some time. Is there anything you need? Harold looked up, momentarily startled by her presence. Oh no, thank you. I'm fine. Just waiting for my daughter. Lisa exchanged a glance with Brian, who nodded slightly, urging her to take the lead. She knelt beside Harold, her tone gentle. It's important to stay hydrated and nourished, especially when you're waiting like this. How about I bring you some water and a snack? It can be hard to wait on an empty stomach. Harold's expression softened at her kindness. That would be lovely, thank you. He paused, his gaze drifting back to the roses. I'm just afraid that if I leave this spot, I might miss her. Trust me, Lisa said, standing up. I'll be back before you know it, and I'll make sure to keep an eye out for her. You can't wait here if you're not taking care of yourself. As she walked away, Brian turned to Harold again. She's right, you know. You need to stay strong. You're doing something incredibly brave, waiting here, but it won't matter if you're not around to see her when she arrives. Harold nodded slowly, his heart heavy with both gratitude and sadness. I just wish I had reached out to her sooner. I let so much time pass. I let pride get in the way. Brian could see the regret etched into Harold's face. It's never too late to try, Harold. Your daughter might be waiting for a sign, something to tell her it's okay to come home. The elderly man's eyes glimmered with unshed tears. Home? That's a word I haven't thought of in a long time. I just wish I could turn back the clock and fix things. You can't, Brian said softly, but you can create a new beginning. She may surprise you. Before they could delve deeper into their conversation, Lisa returned, carrying a small tray with a bottle of water and a sandwich. Here you go, Harold. Just a little something to keep you going, she said, setting it down carefully in front of him. Thank you, kind lady, Harold said, a genuine smile breaking through his earlier melancholy. I appreciate this more than you know. Do you mind if I join you? Lisa asked, her tone inviting. I'd love to hear more about your story if you're up for it. Brian watched as Harold's demeanor shifted, a spark igniting in his eyes. Of course, I'd be honored to share, he replied eagerly. As Lisa settled down beside him, Brian felt a sense of relief wash over him. He had been worried about Harold's well-being, and now it seemed he had the support he needed. Harold took a sip of water, then began recounting tales of his wife, the love they had shared, and the life they built together before it was shattered by loss. I remember the first time I saw her, Harold said, his voice growing animated. It was at a friend's wedding, and I was captivated by the way she laughed. It was like music, pure and joyful. I knew right then that I wanted to spend the rest of my life making her smile. Lisa listened intently, her eyes glistening with empathy. "That's beautiful, Harold. It sounds like you had something truly special." "We did," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But life is a way of throwing curveballs. We lost our son to an accident years ago, and it tore us apart. Instead of coming together, we drifted apart. I never wanted to add to her pain, so I kept my distance. And now I'm losing my daughter too." As the words hung in the air, Brian felt a lump form in his throat. The weight of Harold's grief was palpable, a reminder of how easily love could turn to loss. "You're not losing her yet," Brian said firmly, meeting Harold's gaze. "You're here, and you're fighting for her. That's what counts." "Thank you, Brian," Harold said, a hint of warmth returning to his eyes. "You've been a good friend to me, even when I didn't realize I needed one." "I'm just doing my job," Brian replied, though he felt a tug of pride at Harold's words. "And it's not over yet. You've still got time." As they continued to share stories, more airport staff gathered around, drawn in by the infectious warmth of Harold's memories and the undeniable bond that was forming between them. Conversations began to swirl around the terminal, some sharing their own tales of love and loss, others simply offering a listening ear. "Do you think she'll really come?" Harold asked suddenly, his voice tinged with doubt once more. "I believe she will," Lisa replied, her tone resolute. "And when she does, you'll be ready for her. You've shown so much strength by waiting here, and that speaks volumes." Brian nodded in agreement. "You've already taken the hardest step, Harold. You've opened your heart, and that's what matters most." As the hours continued to tick by, Harold felt a renewed sense of purpose. Surrounded by newfound friends, he recounted more stories, some filled with laughter, others with tears, each one a piece of his heart laid bare for all to see. The roses, once a symbol of only his longing, began to represent a broader spectrum of love. The love for his wife, for his daughter, and the blossoming friendships forming around him in this unlikely place. With each shared story, Brian felt the weight of Harold's burden lighten, and he realized that perhaps this moment was not just about Harold waiting for his daughter, but also about the connections they were all forging in the meantime. Yet, even amidst the camaraderie, Brian couldn't shake the nagging concern that time was still against them. He glanced at the clock, the hands moving steadily, and felt a sense of urgency build within him. Harold's health was fragile, and he could sense that the old man needed to see his daughter soon. "Harold," he spoke up, breaking through the laughter that had filled the air, "if you don't mind me asking, do you have any way to contact your daughter? Maybe there's a chance we could help." Harold sat in his familiar corner of the bustling New York airport, the bouquet of roses resting gently on his lap. The petals, of vivid red, seemed to defy the grayness of the concrete surroundings, much like his own spirit that clung to the hope of a long-awaited reunion that had yet to materialize. 3 days had passed since he had settled into his vigil, and the anticipation had become a bittersweet companion, mingling with the memories of his beloved wife, Margaret, who had left this world years ago. The airport, alive with the sounds of announcements and the shuffling of hurried travelers, felt like a distant world to him. He could barely hear the clattering of suitcases or the chatter of families rushing to their gates. His mind wandered to the past, to moments filled with laughter and love, to years spent holding Margaret's hand, their fingers intertwined, sharing dreams and hopes. The roses were a tribute to those memories, a symbol of love that even time could not erode. Meanwhile, Brian, the airport security officer, was making his rounds when he noticed the elderly man again. Harold had become a fixture in the terminal, a living monument of patience and longing. Brian's concern had deepened over the days, and he approached Harold with a mix of empathy and curiosity. "Mr. Harold," he said gently, kneeling beside him, "how are you holding up today?" Harold looked up, his eyes clouded with the weight of unshed tears. "I'm waiting for my daughter," he replied, his voice a fragile whisper. "She's supposed to be here. She promised." Brian nodded, feeling a pang of sorrow for the old man. "It's been 3 days, sir. Are you sure she's coming?" Harold sighed, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavily in the air. I know she is. She wouldn't break her promise. Not after all this time. Brian studied Harold's face, the lines etched deep from years of weariness, and felt a deep sense of compassion. Maybe she's just at a different terminal. Would you like me to help you find her? At that moment, a flicker of hope ignited in Harold's eyes. Would you? That would mean a lot to me, he replied, his voice trembling with gratitude. The two men stood up, and Harold carefully clutched the roses as he rose, as if they were a lifeline. Brian guided him through the maze of travelers, past shops and food courts, each step echoing with the urgency of their quest. As they navigated through the airport, Brian engaged Harold in conversation, hoping to distract him from the passage of time. What does your daughter do? He asked, trying to piece together the backstory. She's a doctor, Harold said, pride swelling in his chest. She's been working in London for the past few years. We lost touch after. His voice faltered, and he swallowed hard. After your wife passed, Brian finished gently. Harold nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. It was a difficult time for us both. I suppose I didn't know how to reach out. I thought she'd understand my grief. Brian's heart ached for the man, understanding that loss could twist relationships into knots too complex to unravel easily. Have you spoken since then? No, Harold replied, pain etched across his features. I sent her letters, but I'm not sure they ever reached her. I should have tried harder. As they reached the bustling area of another terminal, Brian's heart sank as he realized that the search was becoming increasingly challenging. The throngs of people blurred together, each face a stranger. Harold's health was visibly declining. The color had drained from his cheeks, and he leaned heavily against the wall, breathing shallowly. Let's take a break, Brian suggested, guiding Harold to a nearby seating area. You look tired. Harold sat down heavily, the roses resting on his lap once again. I'm all right, he insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. Brian studied him closely. You've been waiting a long time, sir. It's okay to feel tired. You've shown incredible strength these past few days. Harold closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the memories to wash over him like a gentle wave. My wife always said that love was worth waiting for. I hope my daughter would feel that same love. I just wanted to see her one last time before it's too late for us. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken regret. Brian felt a lump in his throat as he watched the old man's resolve falter. We'll find her, I promise, he said, trying to instill some hope into the moment. I'll get the airport staff involved. We can make an announcement, see if anyone has seen her. Harold nodded slowly, but the flicker of hope in his eyes dimmed. If only I had been a better father, he murmured. Brian, moved by the vulnerability of the old man, leaned closer. You can't change the past, but you can still reach out. This meeting, it could be the start of something new. As the minutes turned into hours, Brian and Harold worked together with the airport staff to broadcast the message over the PA system. Attention passengers. We are looking for Emily, daughter of Harold. Please report to the information desk. The echoes of the announcement resonated through the terminal, but still, no sign of Emily emerged. The worry gnawed at Brian as he returned to Harold, who had grown paler, the roses still clutched tightly in his hands. Harold, I think we should get you some water, Brian suggested, concern etched on his brow. No, Harold insisted, shaking his head weakly. I don't want to leave this spot. What if she comes, and I'm not here? Brian felt a surge of frustration mixed with empathy. I understand, but your health is important too. You're not going to be able to help anyone if you collapse. Harold looked torn, his heart battling with the reality of his physical state. I need to see her. I'm going to get you some water, Brian said firmly, though he hated leaving Harold's side. Just stay right here. I'll be back in a moment. As Brian hurried away, Harold's gaze remained fixed on the entrance to the terminal, where the flow of travelers continued unabated. He felt as if he were a ghost, watching life pass him by. Moments turned into what felt like an eternity. Harold's heart raced as his mind wandered back to the last conversation he had with Emily, a heated exchange that had left them both wounded. He remembered how she had stormed out, her words cutting deeper than any knife. I'm done with you, Dad, she had yelled. You never understood me. The truth was far more complicated, and Harold had never found the right words to mend that rift. An ache settled in his chest, and he clutched the roses tighter, as if willing the flowers to convey the love he had for his daughter, even after all the years of silence. Just as the despair threatened to overwhelm him, the sound of hurried footsteps broke through the noise of the terminal. Harold's heart leaped as he turned, and there she was, Emily, her face flushed, eyes wide with panic. "Dad!" she cried, scanning the area until her gaze locked with his. Brian, who had just returned with water, paused, recognizing the urgency in the moment. He watched as Emily rushed toward Harold, her arms outstretched. "Emily!" Harold's voice cracked with emotion, and he rose unsteadily, the bouquet of roses slipping from his grip and tumbling to the floor. In an instant, the years of hurt and misunderstanding faded away as Emily enveloped her father in a fierce embrace. Harold felt the warmth of her body against his, and it was as if time had rewound, erasing the distance that had grown between them. "I thought I lost you," Emily whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry for everything." Brian stood a few paces away, feeling a profound sense of relief wash over him as he witnessed the reunion. He had hoped for this moment, and now it was unfolding before him with all the raw emotion he had anticipated. "I'm sorry too, sweetheart," Harold said, his voice trembling as he held her tightly. "I never wanted to hurt you. I was lost without your mother." Emily pulled back slightly, searching her father's eyes. "I know. I didn't understand, but I do now. I should have reached out." The two shared a moment of silence, their hearts beating in unison as they took in the weight of the past and the promise of a new beginning. "Let's not wait any longer," Harold said, his voice steadying. "These roses are for you, for us. They symbolize everything I wanted to say." Emily glanced down at the fallen bouquet, then back at her father, her heart swelling with love. "I love you, Dad. I want to make this work. I want to know you again." Brian watched from a distance, feeling a sense of closure and hope in the air. The reunion was not just a moment of joy, but a testament to the enduring power of love, the kind that could bridge even the deepest divides. As they embraced again, the chaos of the airport faded into the background, and for Harold, time seemed to stand still. He had waited for this moment, and now it was finally here. Together, they could begin to heal, and the roses once a. The bustling airport terminal hummed with the sound of rolling suitcases, announcements blaring over the loudspeakers, and the chatter of passengers hurrying to their gates. Yet, in the midst of this chaos, a poignant moment began to unfold as Emily stepped into the terminal, her heart racing. She had received a frantic call from one of the airport staff about her father, Harold, and after days of uncertainty, she finally stood at the threshold of a reunion she had longed for, but feared could never happen. As she scanned the room, her eyes were drawn to a familiar figure sitting in a corner, clutching a bouquet of roses that seemed to wilt under the fluorescent lights. Harold's once vibrant appearance had faded. He looked fragile, and the toll of waiting for 3 long days was evident on his face. Emily's heart sank. She rushed forward, her breath catching in her throat as she approached her father. "Dad," she called out tentatively, her voice barely above a whisper. At the sound of her voice, Harold's head whipped up, his eyes widened in disbelief, and for a moment, it seemed as though the world around them had come to a standstill. The bouquet of roses slipped from his fingers and fell to the ground as he rose unsteadily to his feet. "Emily," he croaked, his voice thick with emotion. In an instant, the distance between them evaporated, and they embraced tightly, tears streaming down their faces. The years of hurt, the misunderstandings, and the silence melted away in that single, powerful moment. "I thought I'd lost you forever," Harold murmured, his voice muffled in the embrace. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I didn't know how much you needed me," Emily replied, pulling back to look into his eyes. The weight of their estrangement hung heavy between them, but in that moment, they both felt a flicker of hope. Harold's hands trembled as he cupped Emily's face, brushing away the tears that flowed freely. "I've missed you, sweetheart. These roses, I brought them for you. They were supposed to symbolize the love I still have for you, despite everything. Emily's heart ached at the revelation. She could see the pain etched on her father's face, the years of longing and regret that had accumulated like dust in the corners of their relationship. Dad, I want to understand. I want to know, why did we let it come to this? Harold took a deep breath, the emotional weight of his words pressing down on him. It's complicated. After your mother passed, I lost myself. I didn't know how to reach out to you. I thought you were angry with me for moving on. But I can see now that it was the distance that hurt us both. Emily nodded, her heart aching for the man who had always been her rock, now so vulnerable. I was angry, Dad, but it wasn't just at you. I felt abandoned. I thought you didn't care anymore. I didn't understand how deep your pain was. As they stood there, surrounded by the hustle and bustle of the airport, the weight of their past began to lift. Harold's heart swelled with hope as he realized that they were finally talking, truly talking, after years of silence. Emily, I never stopped loving you, he said, his voice filled with conviction. These roses were meant to be a symbol of forgiveness. I wanted to show you that I still believe in us, in our family. Emily's heart soared at his words. She took the roses from the ground, cradling them in her hands as if they were the most precious thing in the world. I want that too, Dad. I want us to heal. I want to make things right. Just then, Brian approached them, a warm smile on his face, having witnessed the emotional reunion from a distance. I'm so glad to see you both together, he said, his voice soft and encouraging. It's never too late to mend what was broken. Harold looked at Brian with gratitude. Thank you for looking after my daughter while I was waiting. I didn't realize how much I needed help until now. Brian nodded, his expression sincere. It's my job, but it's also my privilege to witness moments like this, moments of love and reconciliation. Just know that you're not alone anymore. As they stood in the terminal, surrounded by the sounds of the world moving on around them, Emily's face hardened slightly. Dad, there's something I need to tell you. It's about why we drifted apart in the first place. Harold's brow furrowed. What do you mean? There was a family friend who tried to drive us apart. They told me things about you that weren't true. They painted you in a bad light, made me think you didn't care about me. They wanted to manipulate me, Dad, and I fell for it. Harold's expression shifted from confusion to anger. Who? I want to know who would do such a thing. It was Linda, Emily said, her voice trembling. She always acted like she was looking out for me, but I see now that she was just creating distance between us. I should have seen it sooner. Harold's fists clenched at his sides. I should have protected you from her. I thought she was a friend, someone who would support you, but she was only ever about driving a wedge between us. I can't believe I let that happen. Brian stepped in, sensing the emotional surge. I think it's important to address this, both for your healing and for ensuring she doesn't manipulate anyone else. We should report her actions. Harold nodded, determination settling in his chest. Yes, let's do it. This ends here. I won't let her destroy our family any longer. Emily felt a sense of relief wash over her. Thank you, Dad. I want to confront this together. We can't let her continue to wield power over us. With renewed strength, Harold and Emily stood side by side, ready to face the challenges ahead. They had spent years apart, but they now had a chance to rebuild their relationship, piece by piece. As they prepared to take action, Brian could see a transformation taking place before him. The love that had once been overshadowed by pain and misunderstanding was beginning to shine through, illuminating the path forward. He felt honored to have played a part in this reunion and was eager to assist them in any way he could. Let's head to the security office. We can file a report and discuss how to approach this moving forward, Brian suggested, leading the way. With each step, Harold and Emily felt lighter, as if chains that had bound them for years were finally being broken. They walked together, side by side, their hearts open and ready to embrace the future. Dad, Emily said, her voice filled with hope, I believe we can rebuild what we've lost. We just need to be honest with each other from now on. I promise you, Emily, Harold replied, a newfound light in his eyes. No more secrets, no more misunderstandings. We'll face everything together. As they reached the security office, Emily glanced back at the terminal, the vibrant life around them now a backdrop to their renewed bond. They were no longer just a father and daughter separated by pain. They were a family ready to heal, ready to reclaim their love. In that moment, Harold felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The roses in Emily's hands became a symbol not just of forgiveness, but of a future filled with possibilities. They were ready to face whatever came next together. The emotional journey they had embarked upon had just begun, but they were no longer alone. They had each other, and that was a start, a beautiful, hopeful beginning.